Iranian nukes. A terrifying prospect for many in the 21st century, the thought of Iran gaining the bomb sends shivers down the spines of those from Washington to Tel Aviv and beyond. It's undoubtable that rogue states armed with nuclear weapons make the world less safe. It only takes one demagogue with enough power and a grudge to end our little human experiment as we know it. The scariest part, the demagogues in Tehran may already have all the material needed to build the bomb. Iranian nuclear weapons have been one of the most consequential and predictable crises of the 20th and 21st century. But how did we get here? How did years of careful diplomacy and negotiation end in disaster? And who started this whole process? And why, time after time, couldn't Washington, Tehran, and other global partners' slow escalation could ultimately end us all? Get ready to be steeped in a world of ballistic missiles, sanctions, and nuclear physics, where the only thing more dangerous than thermonuclear war is the politicians pushing us towards it. This is the Iran nuclear timeline. Our story begins in 1967, the year of the space race, the Cold War, and, nuclear power. The US has just supplied one of its closest Middle East allies with a shiny new toy, a 5-megawatt nuclear reactor. But this ally isn't any you might expect today, like Israel or Saudi Arabia. Rather, it's a state most of you watching this will think of as one of Washington's greatest enemies, Iran. Now, if your reaction to that was something along the lines of, wait a second, what? Well, just remember that in politics, today's friends are tomorrow's enemies. This was not Iran like you imagine it today, as a Shia dictatorship ruled by the mighty Ayatollah. So Iran, back then, was secular, with close ties to the West, especially the US. After all, you don't give a nuclear reactor to just about anybody, especially one that required weapons-grade uranium in order to work. So why did the US do such a thing? Well, of course, that would be the Cold War. The politics of the Middle East circa 1967 were unrecognizable from how they are today. Iran was a key ally of the United States and an important energy partner, and its pro-Western leader, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, acted as a bulwark against Soviet influence. By 1967, we were only 14 years removed from Operation Ajax, a CIA and MI6-backed coup that toppled the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran. The Shah was installed as a friendlier face to Western governments, and as such, Washington may have wanted to continue to bolster support for the regime. It was important to keep Iran sweet, and the Tehran Research Reactor, or TRR, was a way to do just that. The payback was the Shah putting Iran on a distinctly Western course. His rule was characterized by cooperation with Western nations, oil wealth, and economic modernization. In 1963, for example, the White House aimed to bring Iran into the 20th century with land reforms, literacy campaigns, health programs, and the expansion of women's rights. All of which raises an obvious question. How do we get from a world where Uncle Sam could be like, yo, Iran, you want a nuclear reactor, old boy, to one where the idea of Tehran and weapons-grade uranium would give Pentagon planners night sweats? For that, you could probably thank the Shah's growing autocratic tendencies. Alright folks, quick pause here because I have to show you this little sleek upgrade to my life that is making things a lot easier. This is the Extra Card Holder Pro. Look, you've probably got a big bulky leather wallet. It's stuffed to the brim with receipts and cards that you probably don't even use. Time for an upgrade, right? And look, this is the Extra Card Holder Pro. It's made entirely from recycled aluminium, so eco-friendly as well, which is nice. It holds up to 14 cards, with 5 to 7 fitting snugly in the main compartment, and with their upgraded metal card ejector trigger. Watch this. Wrong way rounds. There we go. You get your cards out quick as a flash. Look, I've got 3 cards in here, and you can just grab whichever one you want, and you're good to go. Plus, they've redesigned the whole shape so it fits super comfortably in your hand, which is nice. They've also got a Finder card in there. It's perfect for someone who's misplacing stuff. I have this on my keys before, like one of those Apple tags, and now I have an ability to find my wallet, which is also super nice. Slips right into the card holder. Quick ping from your phone, boom, you can find it. Android, Apple, all supported. Android, you need the tracker card, by the way. Slightly different, but does the same thing. And look, because it's the holiday season, Extra is offering massive discounts with their Christmas sale. Head over to partner.extra.com/warfronts and use my code WarFronts to get up to 55% off from December 9th to December 25th. Extra wallets make an excellent gift, so perfect for you to upgrade your stuff or maybe a friend or family member. Thank you to Extra for sponsoring. And now back to today's episode. See, by 1979, the Shah had been in power for a generation, and for all his enlightened policy, he spent most of that time consolidating power. As he centralized his strength, the Shah's role became an increasingly authoritarian one. One-party rule was established in 1975, and his secret police, known as the Savak, became infamous for its brutal repression, surveillance, torture, and imprisonment of everyday Iranians. This, combined with widespread social reforms that had mixed popularity and an uneven wealth boom owing to the country's vast natural resources, well, it caused people to become disaffected. And not just disaffected, they were angry. They were pissed off. Whole segments of society turned against the Shah: intellectuals, leftists, students, lawyers, political activists, and most importantly for this story, the Islamic clergy. Protests erupted in 1978 following a series of open letters published by these groups criticizing the Shah's accumulation of power. A cycle of protests, violence, and repression spread across the nation, with many demonstrators losing their lives in the crackdown. On September the 8th, 1978, the pressure finally became too much. The Shah declared martial law, causing security forces to fire on a protest in Tehran's Jalal Square. 100 people were killed in the event now known as Black Friday. Although the government attempted to broker peace in the aftermath, the citizens were by now ready to force through change by any means. They wanted the Shah gone, and they had the perfect replacement candidate, exiled Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Things finally boiled over in January of 1979. The Shah fled into self-imposed exile, Khomeini returned to overwhelming fanfare, and in March, Iranian citizens participated in a national referendum on whether to become an Islamic republic. The referendum had no alternatives. In hindsight, the Iranian people were simply replacing one authoritarian with another. Regardless, it received national support, despite tens of thousands of women taken to the streets that month to oppose the mandatory wearing of the veil. But what's done was done. Iran was now a Shia Islamic republic under the control of a supreme leader and Ayatollah, which is how it still operates to this very day. Nor would the revolution only affect Iran's domestic politics. In November 1979, Iranian protesters overran the US embassy in Tehran, holding 52 hostages for 444 days. This, combined with the growing anti-Western streak, resulted in all diplomatic ties between the US and Iran being severed. From a one-time recipient of advanced American nuclear tech, Iran had fallen to the status of US enemy with remarkable speed. Relations did not improve in the 1980s, with the US Department of State adding Iran to its state sponsors of terrorism list and slapping it with sanctions. Nor did things exactly go swimmingly with regional rivals. The Iran-Iraq War kicked off in 1980 with Iraq's surprise invasion. The conflict dragged on for 8 long years in a brutal war of attrition. The number of deaths were astronomical. Estimates range from a minimum of 500,000 dead all the way up to 2 million. This is important because this wider story will not make sense unless we understand the mentality of Iran at this time, specifically in 1987. An international pariah which no longer had friends in Western places. It was one of the only Shia-majority countries in the world, outnumbered in the Middle East by majority Sunni nations like Saudi Arabia, not to mention Western-backed Israel. Iran was isolated. It was fighting a war that had killed hundreds of thousands of people. Its very existence seemed to be at stake. So in 1987, when a Pakistani nuclear scientist offered to share secrets that could potentially help defend it from enemies all around, Iran took it. Through the network of infamous nuclear proliferator Abdul Qadir Khan, Iran gained access to designs for centrifuges that could enrich nuclear material. The message was clear: Tehran would never be so weakened again. On top of all of this, Iran had been gifted that nuclear reactor 2 decades prior from the United States, a reactor that ran off weapons-grade uranium. So, is anyone really surprised at what happened next? Now, look, when we say weapons-grade uranium, what exactly do we mean? It's important for us to understand how these processes work so that we can figure out just exactly what Iran was up to. And for that, we're going to need to delve into a bit of history and also a bit of nuclear physics. The international community spent a lot of the second half of the 20th century trying to curb nuclear proliferation. The International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, was founded in 1957 to promote the peaceful use of nuclear technology. At the same time, though, the UN General Assembly also drafted what would become known as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, in 1968. While complicated, the short version is that the treaty would, in theory, stop nations gathering and spreading nuclear materials, and all signatories of the NPT would agree to submit to safeguards established by the IAEA. Iran was one such signatory, ratifying the treaty in 1970. Interesting side note on nuclear proliferation: India, Israel, and Pakistan never signed the NPT, whilst North Korea actually did. Iran receiving the centrifuge designs from the Qadir Khan network was a flagrant violation of this treaty. Despite some hiccups in nuclear proliferation along the way, we're looking at you, India and Pakistan, the following decades looked pretty good for the prospect of non-proliferation, even in Iran, at least at first. Tehran's nuclear department, the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, or AEIO, was one of the largest global proponents of nuclear power. The Shah, who, remember, was still in power in 1974, announced plans to generate 23,000 megawatts of energy from nuclear power over the following 2 decades. But after 1979, all that atomic potential was in the hands of a new regime, which found a different, more nefarious purpose for uranium. But how does nuclear enrichment actually work? Well, this is where the physics comes in. Now, there are going to be a lot of numbers here, but trust me, it's vital for understanding the wider story. We're not giving you anything you don't need to know. Uranium is a radioactive metal found naturally in the Earth. It has many purposes, like colored glass, medical imaging, and armor-piercing ammunition. It commonly appears in the isotope U-238, which makes up 99% of the stuff. It's called U-238 because it has 92 protons and 146 neutrons, which makes up 238 total nucleons, giving it its atomic mass. Hence the name. The remaining 1% is another uranium isotope known as U-235. It has a different atomic mass with 143 neutrons alongside the standard 92 protons, which, you guessed it, adds up to 235 nucleons. Now, here is the key part. U-235 is fissile, meaning if you can successfully introduce a neutron into a U-235 atom, it instantaneously becomes uranium-236, which is highly unstable. The unstable atom's nucleus then splits apart, releasing an abundance of energy and neutrons of its own, which can then be absorbed by other U-235 atoms, causing the process to reoccur in what is known as a chain reaction. This energy can be harnessed to make electricity, or to, and we're going to use the scientific term here, cause a really, really big boom. You need lots of U-235 for a successful chain reaction, but as U-235 makes up less than 1% of uranium, its concentration must be artificially increased through a process known as enrichment. Remember when we said that U-235 and U-238 have different atomic masses? Well, this is what that means. In order to separate the two, you place them in a centrifuge, a device that spins at a very high speed. When spun at a specific velocity, the heavier particles separate from the lighter ones, leaving you with the desired U-235 and the spare U-238. This is how uranium and many other radioactive elements are enriched today. And of course, these elements can be enriched to different concentration levels. Low enriched uranium is around 3 to 5% U-235, medium enrichment is anything above 20%, and highly enriched uranium, otherwise known as weapons grade, is anything above 90%. This is the level that was required to fuel that reactor the US gifted Tehran back in Chapter 1. Right, science lesson over, let's get back to the history. Now, you might think, if Iran had weapons-grade fuel for the TRR, why would they need to enrich uranium at all? The answer is both geopolitical and scientific. Fuel for reactors can be converted into weapons-grade uranium required to make nuclear bombs, but it's not easy, it's not sustainable, and it would raise alarm bells all over the world. If Iran wanted to do things discreetly and build an economy of scale, they needed to enrich their own from scratch. And by the 1990s, that is what they'd started to do. However, owing to the secrecy of these programs and facilities, almost nobody knew how far along Iran was in their nuclear proliferation. And then in the early 2000s, the true realities of their program were revealed to the world. And spoiler alert here, the world is not going to be very happy. As 2011 dawned, it did so over an Iran that was more isolated than ever. Congress had passed legislation cutting off the Iranian central bank from the rest of the world. The EU had banned all member states from importing Iranian oil, and there was a total arms embargo underway. The UN Security Council were involved, the IAEA were involved. In short, the world was pissed at Tehran. But how did we reach this point? How did we get from Iran's covert program in the 90s to total economic containment by 2011? Well, back at the turn of the millennium, it was George W. Bush who said, "We don't negotiate with terrorists." How ironic, then, that terrorists exposed Iran's nuclear ambitions. In 2002, the National Council of Resistance on Iran, the political wing of the terrorist organization Mujahideen-e-Khalq, held a press conference exposing Iranian nuclear facilities at Natanz and Iraq. Why did they do this? Well, to make the Iranian government look bad, and it did look bad. So bad, in fact, that the IAEA was immediately on the case. It went from bad to worse a month later when the IAEA called for the end of Iran's uranium enrichment. However, this did little to curtail Tehran's ambitions, as in 2006 it announced that it had successfully enriched uranium to a low level for the first time. But why would Iran need to announce such an obviously provocative thing? It's not like they had to worry about its old enemy Iraq attacking them in the middle of 2006. Well, for Iran, pursuing nuclear weapons was about ensuring the security of the regime, but also symbolizing strength. And you can't symbolize strength through nukes if nobody knows that you're building them. Iraq might have come and gone as a regional rival, but Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States all presented a possible threat to Tehran. A nuclear-armed state has never been successfully invaded and conquered, so Iran's announcement was likely intended as a warning. The downside of such a strategy, though, is that it risks isolation, something the Ayatollah would have been all too aware of. Over 6,000 kilometers away, North Korea was already under the hammer of sanctions for building its own bomb, having tested a device that October. So, Tehran must have expected an almighty backlash. The global community was already grappling with one rogue emerging nuclear power. It absolutely didn't need another one. But at this stage, such grappling with Iran largely consisted of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council and Germany, aka the P5+1, making demands that Tehran refused out of principle. The impasse needed someone to come and break it. And in 2008, with the Bush years drawing to a close, Barack Obama was the one tasked with doing just that. The Bush administration hadn't wanted the international community to see the US negotiating with terrorists. The Obama administration, recognizing just how serious the situation was becoming, didn't have those same hang-ups. After all, everyone could see how the current strategy was going as early as 2009 when Iran successfully launched a satellite into orbit, a move that demonstrated the regime's potential to launch intercontinental ballistic missiles. Such a concept, combined with the country's fledgling nuclear program, was nothing short of terrifying. For the US and its allies, Iran's weapons program were just about the biggest threat to Middle East peace that it was possible to imagine. They threatened the sovereignty of nations like Saudi Arabia and Iraq, and they threatened the very existence of Israel, which might feel a need to declare war if Iran kept pursuing the bomb. The Israeli Prime Minister warned in 2012 that the only way to curtail Iranian proliferation was by, quote, placing a clear red line on Iran's nuclear program. By the mid-2010s, Netanyahu's containment plan included a campaign of bombing, assassinations, and cyber attacks. If Israel was doing all that just to deter proliferation, Western nations really didn't want to find out what it would do if Iran was successful in its pursuits. So another solution needed to be found before Iran could reach the point of rapid nuclear breakout. As we saw, the West had already missed the boat in Pyongyang and would spend the next 2 decades trying to talk the Hermit Kingdom down. They couldn't afford to lose the same battle twice. Sadly, for all the hopes the world attached to it, the fresh approach offered by Obama ultimately didn't make much of a difference. The collapse of negotiations left a sour taste, with Iran placing 2 conditions on further talks: the unanimous lifting of sanctions and a recognition of a right to enrichment. As you can imagine, the P5+1 said no thank you very much to such demands. In response, Iran doubled down, announcing its plans to triple its level of 20% enrichment. This was a step too far for the West, so Congress and the EU got to work placing banking sanctions and banning Iranian oil. For a while, this worked. The IAEA would even wrangle a reluctant invite to visit Tehran and investigate the possible military dimension of its nuclear program. But as we have seen already, negotiating with Iran was like ballroom dancing on a treadmill. 1 step forward, 2,000 steps back. As talks continued between Iran and the P5+1, positive discussion would be mired by Iran's escalations, like opening the Bushehr enrichment facility and ramping up of centrifuge production at the Fordo and Natanz facilities. But while tense and stagnant, all was not lost. A new player was about to enter the game, and his contribution to the nuclear negotiations would, for one brief magical moment, convince the world that the doomsday clock would stop just short of midnight. The name of the new player that everyone could lay their hopes on? Hassan Rouhani, who had just been elected Iranian president in June 2013. A former nuclear negotiator, Rouhani had campaigned on improving an economy that by this stage had been decimated by sanctions. He was committed to ending Iranian isolation in a world filled with nuclear rhetoric. He was a breath of fresh air. And in just a few short years, he would make incredible progress. You see, Rouhani wanted to do things differently. Firstly, he called for the resumption of serious negotiations with the P5+1. When nations met during the UN General Assembly that year, Iran presented the West with a plan that US Secretary John Kerry called very different in the vision of possibilities for the future. Further negotiations would see Kerry state that the P5+1 and Iran had narrowed the differences. To be fair, it was in everyone's interests for progress to be made. Rouhani would get a political win back home by finding a way out of the economic quagmire, while the UN would get to curtail Iran's nuclear progress. President Obama even took a one-on-one call with Rouhani, marking the highest level of engagement between Iran and the US since 1979. Not long after, the IAEA signed an interim deal with Tehran. For the first time in modern history, things looked hopeful. And so we reach the high watermark of the West's engagement with Iran, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA for short. And, well, enjoy it while you can, because it's all downhill from here. Unveiled in 2015, the deal was simple. Iran would blend down the enriched uranium stock it had and would be kept to strict limits under the intense scrutiny of the IAEA. And in return, the West would lift sanctions. But simple as it was also a monumental achievement. Just 5 years before, such a deal had been impossible. Now, here was an agreement that had pundits declaring total peace in this corner of the Middle East, with a deal that should have made everyone safer. Despite the dogged diplomacy needed to get there, all it took was a little political will from Iran and a leader whose priorities lined up with the West's. I mean, could it really have been that easy? Well, not exactly. I'm sorry to burst your bubble here, but there were actually a lot of issues with the JCPOA. First, you had everyone's favorite speed bump, Congress, who just didn't like the deal. Before it was even announced, many senators put forward an open letter directly to the Parliament of Iran. It warned that any deal reached without legislative approval could be revised by the next president with the stroke of a pen. Obama's deal was a political commitment and not a legally binding treaty, meaning any deal made with Iran would not only give the next president the ability to undo years of diplomacy, but that president would also be legally justified in doing so. The deal was ultimately not defeated in the Senate or the House, but it wasn't approved either. But why did US lawmakers not take to the deal? Well, for starters, the US House was deeply distrustful of Iran, and many voted against the JCPOA on the principle that a nuclear deal would still endanger Israel. The Senate also wasn't convinced it could be enforced. You try enforcing rules on an unfriendly state over 11,000 kilometers away, and, well, see how it goes. Then there was the fact that while the period between Rouhani's election and signing the nuclear deal may have been productive, it sure as hell hadn't been peaceful. Early 2010s negotiations were characterized by Israeli and US-led cyber attacks, clandestine assassinations, and drone strikes on Iranian infrastructure and personnel. The Ayatollah even called for Israel's total destruction on more than one occasion, including in November 2014, mere months before the JCPOA was signed. Not exactly the peaceful resolution many associated with the deal. Also, Iran simply wasn't trustworthy yet on the international stage. Several of the stipulations in the interim deal made between Iran and the IAEA had not been met when deadlines hit in August of 2014. Similarly, and more worryingly, was Iran ramping up its own ballistic missile program. Not only had Iran been launching, showing off, and testing missiles, which was in direct violation of the arms embargo, but these missiles were also nuclear capable. Iran would test several new missiles, both in the lead up to and after the JCPOA was signed, in what Tehran might have seen as a show of strength, but the West saw as a sign of disrespect. The world was nervous for a reason. All Iran had to do in theory was introduce the nuclear element, and kaboom. Obama knew the limits of the deal and imposed new sanctions on Iran's missile program almost immediately once it squeaked through. Doesn't exactly inspire a lot of confidence, does it? Ultimately, many argued that the deal was better than nothing, but it certainly wasn't the utopian success that it was initially perceived to be. Eventually, implementation day came and went, with the US and the EU tentatively waiving the sanctions. But would the US and EU come to regret this choice? Well, this video isn't called How the JCPOA Convinced Iran to Be Friendly and Not Pursue Nuclear Weapons, is it? So, well, you could probably guess what came next. In the end, it was the 2016 US presidential election that would cause things to unravel. Donald Trump's approach to the fresh-out-of-the-oven JCPOA was different. Before he even won the presidency, he stated that his number one priority is to dismantle the disastrous deal with Iran. To understand why, we need to look through Trump's orange lens. One of the Don's most prominent campaign slogans in 2016 was America First, and when we apply this logic to the Iran deal, you can see why Trump didn't take to it. Simply put, Trump was asking one question: what did the US get out of it? Trump would say nothing, and materially, he's not wrong. Yes, Iran went some of the way to limiting their nuclear activity, but Iran's missile testing made it appear unserious about adhering to the agreement. And for these violations, Tehran regained access to the global economy to fuel the Ayatollah's anti-American regime. What did the US get? They got a pat on the back for doing the right thing. Other nations saw it differently, that the JCPOA was a foundation from which to build a future peace. However, Trump is a negotiator, if nothing else, and especially in politics, it's better to negotiate from a position of strength. In Trump's worldview, the fact that the JCPOA put Iran on equal footing with the United States made it the worst thing on earth, a bad deal. So what happened next was probably inevitable. That's right, Trump killed it stone dead. That's 5 words that describe many months of political back and forth. Trump didn't walk into the Oval Office on day one and immediately press a giant red button marked no deal. In fact, to start with, his administration even continued to waive the sanctions. But come May 2018, Trump signed papers that would withdraw the US from the JCPOA over time and reimpose the maximum level of sanctions on Iran. The deal still existed and would limp on for a few more years, but the US leaving led to a cycle of escalation that would unofficially end it. It was like Trump pulled the pin on a grenade with a years-long fuse. One reason the 45th president was so willing to detonate the deal may have been that it fit his foreign policy goals. The Trump administration was instrumental during the Abraham Accords, which successfully normalized relations between Israel and several Arab nations. The plan was to create an anti-Iranian alliance that would contain Tehran. Although, given the current meltdown in the Middle East, you could argue that perhaps pulling that pin wasn't the smartest move after all, especially when you remember how many years of delicate diplomacy had been needed to insert it in the first place. In blowing up the JCPOA, Trump likewise detonated America's relationship with the other P5+1 powers. Even before 2018, Washington's European allies had signaled that they would resist US efforts to dismantle the deal. At the end of the day, Iran getting the bomb was the key thing everyone wanted to avoid, and the JCPOA seemed the only way to do so. The other powers even initially set up systems to allow European companies to do legitimate business with Iranian ones and avoid sanctions. By 2018, the other powers were desperate to salvage the Iran deal, but in the end, it just couldn't be saved. Yet for all the ways that the JCPOA's 2018 implosion would scar everyone involved, there was one man who walked away without a scratch. President Rouhani, who had been re-elected back in 2017, took the opportunity not to saber rattle and yell threats, but to play a clever geopolitical game. Shortly after the US pulled out, Rouhani announced that Iran would attempt to continue negotiations with the other JCPOA states. With the leaders of France, Germany, and Britain restating their commitment to the deal, it was the perfect time to drive a wedge between the US and Europe. If Tehran was going to be sanctioned regardless, it might as well take the opportunity to weaken the links between DC and its allies. As a result, the only nation to benefit from this mess was Iran. The European powers and the US were bickering. There was some way around some of the sanctions, and Iran could now blame its escalations on America forcing its hand. Meanwhile, neither the EU nor the US got what it truly wanted from the exchange. And now, the US had nothing to bargain with, not even offering a full commercial relationship, and an end to sanctions would do it. Iran was never going to accept a deal that was ostensibly worse than the JCPOA. Not to mention that, like the JCPOA, it would take years to implement such an agreement, and the political will simply wasn't there. In short, the Trump administration thought that an unprecedented level of sanctions would bring Iran back in line and give the US a better deal. Instead, Iran lashed out, and the US ended up with no deal at all. And what was Iran up to? Tehran wouldn't sit idly by whilst the JCPOA crumbled around it, surely. No, in fact, it was more than happy to contribute to the crumbling. Remember when we said that the US leaving the deal would lead to a cycle of escalation that would ultimately kill it stone dead? Well, here we are. In the years after Trump became president, Iran threatened to research nuclear propulsion for marine vessels and continued to test missiles. It sent weapons to the Houthis in open violation of the arms embargo. It tried to launch satellites, bickered with the IEA, and ramped up centrifuge production, among many other smaller acts of escalation. Although Tehran would complain after sanctions were reimposed that they weren't in the spirit of the deal, well, neither was test-firing ICBMs. But by the time the COVID-19 pandemic arrived, there were so many sanctions levied against Iran that the Ayatollah's dog walker's card would have been declined for trying to buy kibble. With the pandemic and a contentious election forcing the US to turn inwards for a while, Iran was able to use this global pause to return to its nuclear priorities. By the time the world finally emerged bleary-eyed from lockdown, Tehran would get closer to the bomb than ever. While Iran was busy with its nuclear ambitions, the US was going through its own upheavals. After a summer of lockdowns and riots, Trump was turfed out of the White House by voters, a decision that wind up pressing the undo button on just 4 years later. For now, though, the guy in charge would be the former vice president from when the Iran deal was signed. But would Joe Biden and his administration be able to steer things back towards the JCPOA? It was a long shot, for sure, but they had to try. And try they did. Biden's newly appointed Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said in March of 2021 that if Iran comes back into compliance with its obligations under the nuclear agreement, we would do the same thing. Similarly, the Joint Commission of the JCPOA met in Vienna, with two groups being formed to look at the sanctions the US would need to lift, and in exchange, which limits would need to be reimposed on Iran. But these talks ultimately came as too little too late. Supreme Leader Khamenei responded to these gestures of goodwill when he stated that Iran could enrich uranium to whatever levels the country needs. President Biden, ever the diplomat, referred to this as unhelpful, which is like saying that Thanos was a bit of a Other international actors and events didn't help matters, though. January of 2022 saw China put 4 million barrels of Iranian oil into its state reserves, flagrantly violating US sanctions. This gave Iran even less incentive to negotiate with the US, while also pulling Tehran closer to Beijing. And then, at the worst possible moment, in late February of 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. The invasion sent US foreign policy into a tailspin over how to respond. Prior to this, Iran was the priority. Now, Russia was the priority. As such, developing a diplomatic solution to Iran's burgeoning proliferation was put on the back burner at a time when it really needed to be not just on the front burner, but cascading out into the kitchen and into the dining area. But why did more focus need to be placed on Iran? Well, that's because the JCPOA was dead in the water. Tehran was unwilling to negotiate new terms and purposefully delayed talks as it pushed forward with its nuclear progress. Action was needed on Iranian proliferation, but the Biden administration's rhetoric alone couldn't bring Iran back to the table. And why would it? From the Iranian perspective, Tehran spent the first half of the 2010s negotiating a deal that would work for it, only to have it ripped up as soon as a new president arrived. What would stop the next president altering it again? Iran couldn't function as a nation on the ever-changing political whims of DC, so it stopped engaging. In short, Tehran was thinking, well, what's the point? The poor relationship between Iran and the IAEA was also reaching its climax. Tehran said that no deal would be implemented unless the IAEA permanently closed its safeguards investigation around Iran's pre-2003 nuclear program. Iran and the IAEA's relationship was always a roller coaster, but this era represented the big drop at the end, with Tehran having removed designations from senior IAEA members. It also blocked inspectors, shut off monitoring cameras, and dragged its feet over any discussions after systematically renouncing every commitment it had made under JCPOA. But it was the pre-2003 investigation that was the final nail in the coffin. The Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1970 required the IAEA to investigate a state's nuclear activities. The agency could not go against its own mandate for Iran's sake. But just because Iran was firmly moving towards the bomb and directly flouting international norms doesn't mean other nations had to like it. Secretary Blinken said what everyone was thinking, declaring, Iran seems either unwilling or unable to do what is necessary to reach an agreement. French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian concurred and summed up the issue perfectly when he stated, there is partial, timid, and slow progress, but negotiations cannot continue at such a slow pace, while, in parallel, Iran's nuclear program advances so rapidly. Meanwhile, Iran was censured by the UK, France, Germany, and the US, with scathing reports criticizing the regime for dragging its feet. But harsh words were not going to hurt Tehran, nor are they going to derail its progress. And what of Iran's progress? How close to actually building a nuke had they gotten? Well, Iranian state accounts report that they already had the materials necessary to do it, but hadn't decided whether or not to. This strategic ambiguity is by design. In holding its cards close to its chest, Iran can still maintain the threat of a nuclear weapon without making itself a greater international pariah by openly building and testing one. Similarly, such strategic ambiguity could prevent the Israelis from preemptively bombing the shit out of its facilities, as they likely would in the event of Iran's nuclear seeds bearing fruit. But despite some statements from Secretary Blinken, who said in July of 2024 that Iran's breakout time was a number of weeks, nuclear weapons, as you can probably imagine, are just a little bit more complicated than that. Breakout refers to the time a state would need in order to enrich the uranium for a nuclear weapon, but that material still needs to be constructed and weaponized alongside other technological advancements that Iran hasn't reached yet. This isn't the most difficult barrier for Tehran to overcome, but it means that Iran won't be getting a nuclear weapon immediately, and the world likely would get some warning before it happened. However, exact dates are hard to come by. Some reports, like from then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mike Milley in 2023, suggest Iran would need mere months to go fully nuclear capable. Other assessments have put the threshold at a year or more. Regardless, Iran will seemingly be unable to build up a serious and deployable nuclear arsenal for a not insignificant amount of time yet. But the chances of them not getting a bomb at all Well, those days appear to be over. And that's where we're at today. As we've hopefully shown you, the timeline of events from the formulation of Iran's nuclear program to the escalation of the 2000s and the rise and fall of the JCPOA have been fraught with difficulty on all sides. With regional rivals well within ICBM range, a nuclear-armed Iran represents a major threat to peace not only in the region but in the world. One can't help but wonder if something could have been done differently along the way, or if we were always doomed to walk this path of atomic escalation. Could a different, more robust and lasting nuclear deal have kept the peace? Could Iran have acted less brazenly with the IAEA? We'll never know. Iran has given up a lot in its pursuit of the bomb. Its economic status as a nation, its place in a functioning international order, and most importantly of all, the safety of its own and other nations' citizens. Let's just hope for all of our sakes that this doesn't turn out to be merely the prologue of a much bleaker tale, the story of how nuclear war eventually came to the Middle East. Thank you for watching.